Despite it being the dead of the NBA offseason, Paul George continues to open up on what specifically went wrong in his negotiations with the Clippers and had some interesting comments on how his feelings were while having his father on the podcast this week. I'm going to break down exactly what was said, my full take on why these conversations need to stop, and overall why I think things have been blown out of the proportion to an extent, as well as why I think there's an interesting parallel to the James Harden negotiations here in Philadelphia. So let's dive right into it. I'm going to kick things off with what specifically was said. This coming from Paul George Sr., who once again was on the podcast with his son here, and he was asked his thoughts on the Clippers negotiations. And there's two quotes that I do want to highlight here. Number one, he says, quote, "I feel like they stabbed us in the back. Paul did a lot for the team. He felt that that was a bunch of bull that they came at him with, and I wasn't going to sugarcoat it either." And then the next quote, which I think picked up a little more traction online, the same kind of beginning, that I feel like they stabbed us in the back because I thought Paul did a whole lot for the team. I was looking at it, okay, we're going to go next door to the Lakers, but they already spent too much money. So the Lakers obviously thrown in the mix. That seems to be the team that whenever any superstar is available or any, role player, overhyped guy, whatever, it wants to be attached to the Lakers there. The reality is this was not anything that was ever legitimately on the table or there being a possibility of. Paul George made it very clear that he was choosing his location with his wallet this summer, and ultimately that ended up being Philadelphia. That was a grand scheme, but from Daryl Morey to add a player of his magnitude and caliber that I understand that he might not be what the Clippers hoped he could be as a riser, as a number one or a number two on a championship contending team, but he's still a damn good basketball player, coming off a season averaging 22.6 points per game. And I will once again highlight what I think will specifically translate well to this Sixers team: 41.3% from three and 45.7% on the corner. He is a guy that when you think about his critiques as a player, I think falls squarely on his shoulders as a number one or a number two. I think when thinking of him in the context of the Sixers team, you feel a lot better about how those weaknesses go. Now, I understand the hurt feelings from both sides of things here. That from Paul George, to start with this, once again, I do think that it came down to money, and he did reveal exactly how these negotiations went on a separate episode of the podcast that he was asked about to detail the negotiations, how things went, and LA's first offer of a 2-year, $60 million deal. That is kind of a slap in the face to the guy that is viewed as part of the franchise cornerstone that it was his and Kawhi's organization, and that did feel low there. Now, they went back and forth. They had a little bit of negotiation, his final ask being the 4-year, $220 million, and you can argue that Paul did move the goalposts a little bit in these negotiations. I think that was a direct result of him feeling a little bit, I guess, shaded by the first offer or not getting exactly what he was expected there, and ultimately, that's why these Sixers were such a key part of this. That is why Daryl Morey had this grand cap space plan, something that I personally was skeptical of, and I know a lot of other people, because it's very rare that a superstar can just walk away from a team and sign a max contract with another. That just does not happen in the sport of the NBA very often. It is since 2019 that last happened at the NBA level without some sort of sign and trade. Or more often than not, we see these guys signing the long-term security, signing these max contracts, even with the knowledge that you're probably not playing out the entirety of that contract with that team. I think Donovan Mitchell is an example of that with this summer, that he did take the security of knowing that he is going to get that set dollar amount, even though more likely than not that there probably will be a breakup with Cleveland down the line. That is the trade-off that organizations and teams get. And by the way, Paul George kind of had the Clippers empty the tank to get him in a way that has aged particularly poorly. And to revisit exactly what that trade is, which I think is what a significant amount of these hurt feelings come from Clippers fans, we're talking about the full trade being Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, Danilo Gallinari, a 2022, 2024, 2028 first-round pick from the Clippers, as well as a 2021 from Miami, and that adds a bunch of other protected picks. In total, that's 3 protected and 4 unprotected first-round picks, along with Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, which straight up, you want to do the one-for-one argument, that Shai has turned out to be the better player there. Now, I understand he was younger in his career arc, that the timeline did not match up, but Shai is the real deal, a guy that I think probably is in the driver's seat for having an MVP case this year. You could have made the case for him last year as well. He is the real deal. He is that alpha dog, and that is something that critique of Paul George has not quite gotten. Now, as far as these conversations as a whole, I will say I'm sick of hearing about the Clippers and Paul George breakup. I will say that I think Clippers fans are holding it a little bit too strongly to Paul George, when I think we can all just call a spade and say it comes down to money. And that is why I think there is the comparison to the James Harden situation here in Philadelphia. That, let's not forget, James Harden took things to such a long extent that he was speaking about how Daryl Morey is a liar in front of a group of Chinese campers that he did have, here, and even calling out Daryl Morey as a liar from a bottle service girl sign in the club here. It was some electric movement, some hilarious stuff looking back on it, but not the most professional way that he handled things by any means. Paul George has not taken things to that extent. But I think the clear disconnect in both of these situations, the player wants a certain amount of money. The organization draws a line in the sand that we're not willing to give it to you. And that's pretty much the end of story. That there aren't the feelings that go into this. There isn't the personal attacks that it is. The reality is that the player thinks they're worth something and the organization thinks they're not. Now, in James Harden's case, that there wasn't this clear-cut other option. There wasn't this safety route, this, floating other offer out there that he could have jumped on. That's why he did go the route of opting into that player option, guaranteeing the $35 million. And I'm not going to say victory lap for Daryl Morey just yet, because I do think James Harden's going to put up some pretty absurd numbers out in LA, especially if Kawhi is not on the court on a regular basis, that we're going to see some Harden ball back in the Clippers. Now, I don't think that directly translates to winning a championship. In fact, I'm very confident that it doesn't, that I think the James Harden situation is, even when he's not the best player on the team, which he won't be with Kawhi there, that he is so integral to whether or not that team wins every single game because of how ball dominant he is, because of him not really being effective on the defensive side of the ball, or when he does not have the ball in his hands, that when Harden step back threes are falling or he's feeling it, it's going to be a fun night and the team is going to have some success. But there's plenty of nights where that isn't the case as well. Now, I do think Paul George, on the other side of things, is not quite that level of player from a dependency standpoint. I think there can be games this season in which Paul George does not play well and the Sixers still win. And that to me is a great thing, that I do think he's not this ball dominant guy, that he can still make his impact felt, doing a little bit of the dirty work, playing some defense, hitting corner threes, not needing the ball in his hand 24/7 in the way that we did see with James Harden. But from the contract standpoint, that obviously the Sixers felt that way too. That Daryl Morey very clearly made the stance that James Harden was not worth this full-time max scale, which was the disconnect in those negotiations. And Paul George is, that he was comfortable handing him that amount of money. And by the way, I do think Daryl Morey deserves a little more credit for that. Now, granted, we do not know what was said in those rooms, whether or not Daryl did break a promise. My guess, my honest reading between the lines and what I think happened, is there was probably some breakdown in communication along the lines of Daryl saying things like, we'll take care of you, or, we're going to get it done, or we'll take care of you in the offseason, something along those lines rather than specifics, which in James Harden's heart of hearts, he definitely expected a full-scale max. This was his guy. Daryl is the dude who stuck up for him. Really, they grew together professionally. That the first all-in move from Daryl Morey as a general manager in Houston was to trade that haul of picks for James Harden, and then he grew into a superstar well beyond what anyone would have expected at that time. Don't forget, he was a sixth man on the Oklahoma City Thunder team with Kevin Durant and Russell Westbrook before that. That Daryl Morey took a risk, and James Harden more than delivered on what he grew into becoming. I think James expected to be rewarded here in Philly. Now, for Paul George here, I'm ready for this book to be closed. I don't want to hear throughout the season all this Clippers nonsense, all this drama. I understand that this falls squarely on the shoulders of Paul George, that the material we're talking about is coming directly from his podcast, and I understand that drama sells. That's what gets clicks. I know what you're doing. I understand how the game works, but I will be frustrated if we get to the actual basketball court and that stuff that's taking priority over winning basketball games, or I'm hearing more about that rather than the preparation for games against the teams that this Sixers team needs to find a way to beat. But overall, I do hope that there can be a little bit of a closed book here. I do think we should recognize that this really does just come down to money, and that is the line in sand that people are upset about. You can act about their feelings, whatever you want to sugarcoat it or present it as. The reality is, it just comes down to Paul George thought he was worth more than the Clippers did, and the Sixers called their bluff. That Paul George said, if you're not going to pay me, somebody is, and that's exactly how things went down there. So we'll see if this continues on or drags, but I really don't think this is as big of a deal as a lot of the Clippers media, fans, organization, everybody is making it out to be. I don't think there's some backstabbing. This is simply business. But let me know if you guys agree with me in the comments and how similar you think it is to the James Harden situation there. Do want to hear from you guys and cannot wait for basketball to returning to the floor soon. So make sure you're smashing that subscribe to tag along with everything that we got going here on Sixers Digest. Drop a like on this video, and I'll be talking with you next time. Peace.